All right, so we'll go ahead and get started now. Thank you everyone for coming to our November SMCA affiliates meeting. Our topic is, of course, citizen enforcement. And today we have two guest speakers with us from the Patuxent Riverkeeper and Chesapeake Legal Alliance. So our agenda looks like this. We'll do some SMCA updates, and then Greg will talk about an intro to regulation and issues with implementation. And then we'll hear from Fred from the Patuxent Riverkeeper perspective about citizen enforcement. And then we'll hear from Patrick DeArmy with the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, and end with some Q&A as well. So first item, I just wanted to give some SMCA updates. And the first is the notion of expanding the rural legacy area. So two SMCA organizations have been working toward expanding rural legacy because, as you all know, rural legacy is one of our biggest tools in Southern Maryland for preserving land. And as you can see on these maps, the pink layer is our priority preservation area, and the orange is the portion of that which is in rural legacy currently. And as you can see on the maps, it's about half. I don't know if I'm bad at estimating, but to me that looks like about half is in rural legacy. And then if we look at our priority preservation map along with the nature network cores and connectors, it's even less. And so we have been working to expand the rural legacy area and then in turn expand one of our tools for conserving land to better achieve our goals for preservation here. And so ACLT and Scenic Rivers Land Trust have both been working to expand rural legacy independent of one another in our respective counties. But here I'm just going to show briefly what ACLT is proposing. This area of Calvert from Hunting Creek to Fishing Creek has been largely neglected by rural legacy, but it remains an important area given our priority preservation, as well as the Nature's Network cores and connectors. It's pretty much all a habitat core according to this map. And so that's why we've been working to expand it in this area. And so I just wanted to give everyone a brief update on that because it's a process we're starting, but we will continue to update you as more progresses. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about real quick is that we are planning right now for our water quality blitz in spring of 2024. If you recall, last year we invited for the first time organizations outside of Calvert to participate in the water quality blitz. And we invited every SMCA organization who was interested. And we had, I think, 6 additional organizations participate last year for a total of 10 organizations testing in across 95 sites and in 4 different counties. And so we are inviting everyone again this year to participate. If you didn't participate last year, or you also participated last year and want to continue to do it, just to let everyone know, we're going to start planning for this. And as a reminder, last year we asked each organization to select at least 3 sites in their watershed that they could access easily, either on property they owned or property or a site on a stream that would cross a public road. And it's roughly $12 per sample. And we do ask the organizations participating to cover the cost of sampling. So we think this is a really great way, like I've said before, to expand citizen water quality monitoring because it's cost effective and it's only once a year, so it doesn't require much time commitment. So begin thinking about whether this is something you want to participate in this year, and we'll send out more information in the coming weeks, but let me know if anyone is interested after this meeting. And actually, Water Quality Blitz is a good segue into our guest speakers because for citizen enforcement, often the first step is monitoring and actually identifying problem areas. And so our friends groups in doing monitoring have already noticed problem areas, and they've come to us with these problems and questions about what they can do next, if anything, to address these issues, especially if they think there's a connection with the water quality issues and potential environmental regulation violations. And so our speakers here today are here to tell us that yes, there are actions that citizens can take, and they'll give some insight into what those are. So I'm going to hand it over to Greg to give us an intro to regulations.
Thank you very much. So many of you know I'm an executive director of the American Chestnut Land Trust. Before that, sometime before that, I was planning director for Calvert County. And as part of that, I was involved in writing regulations. When it comes to environmental permit enforcement, nature plays at a huge disadvantage. Watersheds are not like a neighbor or a community association that can easily rally up on something that they're concerned about. Waterways tend to divide neighbors rather than unite them. They are a physical separation that usually one does not cross. Stormwater devices are not easy to see or to access, and when they fail, usually only those downstream know about it. I've written lots of regulations for Calvert County, and I used to be in charge of enforcing critical area regulations, for example. Neighbors often don't speak up because it's, quote, not their business, close quote, unless they see something that's really bad. So how does one know if there are pollutants in the water, and or if there's if what is happening there will destroy an SAV bed, submerged aquatic vegetation bed, or the macroinvertebrates that are in a freshwater stream? And by the way, the applicants on major projects, usually developers, who contribute heavily to campaigns and are quick to point out how they're good for economic development. And inspectors sometimes, who are hard on developers, are shown the door. At the Southern Maryland Conservation Alliance, we are emphasizing the importance of nature and protecting lands, and our friends groups are studying and documenting the impacts of pollution on all types of nature. But more needs to be done to level the playing field so that nature stands a chance in court and other ways. I want to also recognize Amalia Pleak-Tam. She is an environmental planner for Calvert County. I think this might be your first time on, Amalia, and we're really pleased to have you with us. And with that, I think Fred is taking the ball.
Okie doke. So I'm Fred Tuckman. I've been the riverkeeper on the Patuxent River for the last 20 years. Actually, I think 2024 marks 20 years since we were founded. So, I would say the heart of our work at Patuxent Riverkeeper is citizen-based enforcement. And let me tee up my little share screen thingy here. Make sure I can get it to work. I always have trouble with slideshow. Normal? No, that's not it. What's the right switch to actually show? Oh, there it is. You hit slideshow and then you go from the beginning. All right. I don't know why I have to relearn this every time. Forgive me. So I want to talk a little bit about my particular take on this. I came from literally from age 15. I started anchoring the news at WFCR in Amherst, Massachusetts. I started pretty early in the media business, and it relates a little bit to my work as a riverkeeper because I landed in television, working at places like 60 Minutes, 2020, hard copy, tabloid news shows. Never worked for Geraldo Rivera, as much as he called many times, but we always argued about money. And so my take on this is that the ethos that applies as a riverkeeper is very different than the ethos that applied when I was an investigative journalist. I worked for a show for some years called Breakaway back in the early 80s, before Fox Television existed. There was Metro Media. Some of you are old enough to remember Metro Media. Metro Media tried to compete with Good Morning America with a TV show called Breakaway, a morning show. And I was part of the investigative news team for Breakaway. And there were no rules. They actually encouraged us to break the law to get the story. They didn't care how you got the story. During that era, I wore a lot of Hawaiian shirts and sunglasses because it was embarrassing to be a part of this outfit that would do just about anything to get a news story. We'd hide in the bushes out in front of some public official's house. We would do all kinds of wacky stuff. I remember CBS News asking me to break into St. Elizabeth's mental hospital to get an interview with John Hinckley after he attempted to assassinate the president. And they told me that they had lawyers standing by so that I wouldn't have to worry about getting arrested for trespassing because they'd get us out in 20 or 30 minutes. So I guess my point is, in the nonprofit world, when you're not working for rich corporations with unlimited legal money, the ground rules are obviously very, very different. And you have to be a lot more circumspect about how you collect information, collect news, or in our case, really collecting information that can be used for enforcement purposes. So I walked on the industry. I mean, my civic activism was a much thinner version of me, carrying picket signs over a sludge dump in Prince George's County during the 1980s. And eventually led me to go to law school to kind of reboot my career. And there I spent 3 years essentially learning the underpinnings of what later became Patuxent Riverkeeper. Here's a site that some of you might remember. This is a site right at the Benedict Bridge, a mobile home park that was largely removed due mostly from citizen activism. It was teachers in Calvert County that started raising noise about kids coming to school without having bathed, without having access to drinking water. These were housing code violations that seem to have gone kind of unregulated in the county. And we struggled with how to find a solution to what had become a pollution problem, because in the winter, the pipes would freeze up under these mobile home parks and drain sewage into the nearby river. The irony being, just a few hundred feet away is this coal burning power plant that was basically violating laws for breakfast. Yet we had this poverty site that essentially went unregulated. And the question was proportionality. In other words, how do we do something about this problem that doesn't impose a fresh human burden on the people living there? And eventually, from what I gather, the county was able to resituate people and to use social services and various other things. The site was sold and by the state. And I guess it has a future for the Department of Natural Resources. But my point is here that, again, it was citizen noise, citizen activism that actually kind of moved the needle on getting something done here. So I'm a big fan of squeaky wheels. And like I said, it's really the basis of the entire Riverkeeper movement. The deal is that you find a violation, or you see a violation, you observe a violation, you document it, you report it to the lawful enforcers, and you follow up to make sure they actually do what it is that they're supposed to do. And this is a good thing, right? This actually raises the currency of the kind of enforcement that can be done, because people sitting in Baltimore or Annapolis or someplace in an office who are charged with regulating various pollution sites or potentially polluting sites can't possibly know about all of these things unless citizens play a role to help bring to the attention of the lawful enforcers a problem that might be taken on. So waterkeepers actually do something I think that's kind of unique in the environmental frame. We essentially try and take enforcement into the private sector, and we try to sustain our organizations using that process. Some of us in the waterkeeper universe have actually become bounty hunters. In fact, that's actually how the waterkeeper movement started on the Hudson, was they used the Rivers and Harbors Act, kind of outdated law, to essentially split the fines that they exacted with the government. And that's what literally financed what became probably the most influential and powerful waterkeeper organization in America, basically making it unprofitable for polluters to do what they do. But the key is that you cannot break the law. You cannot go about collecting information or evidence for enforcement that involves violating laws. That's the contaminated tree, basically, the fruit of the contaminated tree. If you have illegal drone footage or illicitly obtained information from a trespassing incident, you certainly cannot use that as a basis for enforcement whatsoever. And mind you, there is a subtext in the conservation world of folks who don't believe in finger pointing. I've heard the term used many, many times. In fact, I went to a River Network conference. Some of you might be familiar with the River Network conferences, where a couple of guys, obnoxious guys, got on an elevator and said, "Oh, are you one of those river keepers that run around making noise, making trouble, and scaring off the funding for the rest of us?" I mean, it's kind of like, do you still beat your wife, right? It's not a question you can legitimately answer when it's framed that way. I actually believe that not much gets done unless somebody can point a finger. If you can't name a problem, you certainly can't solve a problem. You don't know how to go about dismantling a problem if you can't quite get to the point where you can actually identify the source of the issue. So remember, in the case of citizen enforcement, right, we all have the same right to report enforcement. We don't have any lawful enforcement capacity. I mean, I guess we could bring civil suits if we wanted to. Not much likely to come from that avenue. But if we're talking about actual law violations, bringing them to the attention and reporting them to the lawful enforcers is only natural. So we also use the media, and we say things about our pollution cases in the media that help drive and put pressure on the enforcement thing. And a lesson I learned from working at Breakaway in that investigative news show is that we were always told to imagine if the people you're reporting on, imagine if their mothers read this story. That's the picture we often had in our minds. They see that in the newspaper and, oh my gosh. But remember, there's a narrow band where you're not trying to inflict harm per se. You're trying to inflict pressure to get attention paid to a problem that needs to be solved. And so all of this is a tactic, a strategic tool designed to raise the culture of enforcement wherever we can possibly do that. And by the way, I forgot to start my counter, so maybe Greg, you can tell me when I'm 5 minutes out. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about slap suits, but I will spend a little time about it, not because I want to scare you guys off, because the slap suits are actually kind of rare, but in the process of talking about them, we get to tease out some of the key ideas that go into how to do citizen enforcement and not get slap sued, essentially. The big deal here, and I want to talk a little bit about a local case that we ran into, Vera's White Sands Beach Club in Calvert County, some of you might be well familiar with. We had complaints from citizens who live in the community, but we also had a request, and I can say this now because something I couldn't say as recently as 4 years ago. The key informant here was actually Bernie Fowler. Bernie Fowler asked us to intervene here and work on this issue. And at a certain point in time, we actually did get slap sued by this establishment. But their game was to get us to reveal the name of the informant, which of course was Bernie. And there was no way we were going to put Bernie in harm's way with a polluter that had a history of actually suing their neighbors and others who had criticized their operation. I visited the site, gave the manager on duty my business card, told her why I was there, investigating a citizen and neighborhood complaint, observed some things like homemade stormwater stuff, a gas pump that didn't seem to have a permit, a variety of kind of self-help things going on the site that sort of mirrored the issues that the community had brought to my attention. I did some research, delved into county records just to corroborate what I was seeing there, and found that the state of Maryland was already suing these guys for $300,000 for various violations. And so I did no further work. That's significant because after doing no further work, we were then sued by these folks, arguing that our letter of report to the state of Maryland, let me see, I even have a copy of that letter. You won't have time to read all of it. But all we did was send a letter reporting to the state of Maryland what we had seen, encouraging them to pursue an enforcement action there. And for our trouble, we were actually sued. It turned out we were overinsured. The two insurance companies that we had at that time actually worked it out amongst themselves who paid the legal bills to essentially make a case go away that eventually went to trial. Surprisingly so, because Maryland actually has a slap suit or an anti-slap suit statute. And this thing went to trial because the judge in Calvert County decided that it would. And eventually the case was dismissed and the insurance company paid the bills. And one of my concerns was that our insurance rates would go up as a result of the case. And it turns out they did not, that the insurance company recognized that our blameless activity was what had triggered this. Now, here's a mistake that I did make that in retrospect was problematic. As a riverkeeper, I take all sorts of complaints and issues and reports from citizens. In this instance, this was a hot scenario where the polluter had actually been litigating with its neighbors for years. And it's not unreasonable if you look in retrospect that he would assume that if the riverkeeper's banging on his door for compliance, that somebody sent us. And I didn't think about that at the time. I thought of our, attempts at enforcement as fairly, tame, very much within the law. But it didn't occur to me that the polluter themselves would assume we were part of a conspiracy. And they wrote all sorts of letters describing how we had forced the state to come after them and this and that. Eventually, the state of Maryland wrote a letter for us, actually pointing to telling the judge that our report had nothing to do with it, that it actually predated our visit to the site. But I bring this up because there was a word that I used in describing the owner of the place, because he had called me and yelled at me and cussed at me and called me a bunch of names and talked about how rotten his neighbors were. I used the word bellicose. I described him because I wanted the enforcers to understand and not be distracted by this guy's attempts to essentially scare people off. That his bark was pretty harsh, forget about his bite. His bark was pretty rough. And I described it as bellicose. I don't know if I have a definition. Yes. Unusual word from my British education. Actually, I did grow up in Tanzania, where I was learned a bunch of words that are probably not in common uses, but bellicose was one. I'm not sure this guy even knew what it was, what it meant, but he seized on that as a subjective defamation. So let me talk a little bit about what defamation is and what it isn't. It's basically stuff that you say that's aimed with malice to create a certain effect in the public domain, and it basically dragging someone's name through the mud for some nefarious purpose, which certainly was not what we were doing. The typical defenses to defamation would be truth, like we're not making this stuff up. This stuff really happened. The First Amendment, which is the right of free speech that we all have under the Constitution, and in the public interest. And this case was dismissed on all of those grounds, essentially. But again, it showed us some things about how to look before you leap, know at least enough about the scenario that you're walking into so that you can actually protect yourself. I do want to reflect briefly on where this whole idea of defamation actually came from, because it does have an interesting genesis. The New York Times, the Sullivan case, way back in the dark ages, was actually a case filed against the NAACP, that these slap suits initially were something being used by folks opposed to civil rights to basically silence civil rights activists. And the New York Times and Sullivan case was a pretty rough one, where the NAACP, as a fundraiser, had bought airtime or space in the New York Times as a fundraiser. And a number of the things that they said about things that had happened in the South were more or less not well fact-checked, let's say. So they lost the case at the trial court, appealed it. It ended up in front of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically issued a holding that insulated both the public and the press from making certain types of statements for which they could be held liable. And that's literally the genesis. And I only mention it because people wouldn't make that assumption that slap suits kind of originated as a means of chilling civil rights statements, discouraging people from saying stuff in the media that was actually more or less true, or at least true in spirit, but that gave offense to people who were opposed to civil rights. So I just wanted to kind of make that note. I can't resist mentioning another infamous one, the Jerry Falwell case. Again, won't spend much time on it, but basically Hustler magazine ran a ridiculous ad that was a parody that talked about Jerry Falwell doing indecent things with his mother in an outhouse. And again, this case was lost at the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court opined that while it was untrue, it was obviously a parody, and no one would possibly agree or believe that Jerry Falwell would do something untoward in an outhouse that involved his mother. And so the case was dismissed. So there's a long and twisted history about what you can and cannot say in a public domain about a polluter or anybody else. Here's a very simple one. Forgot the date on this one, but it's fairly recent, where someone said something about a housing developer on their blog and then was sued as a reprisal by the housing developer. And again, the case is dismissed. As I mentioned earlier, Maryland does have a slap suit or anti-slap suit statute. So here we have a case in Columbia, Maryland, the northern part of the Patuxent watershed. This is a local activist who took these pictures of a restoration site, literally a couple of blocks from where she lived. She was mad because all the wildlife had fled, that they knocked down all the trees, that they basically left the construction company a big mess behind them. And they were very, very unhappy. And so she wrote an article or an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun, and then received a letter from the lawyers for the housing developer demanding that she stop saying bad things about their project in her public oratory. Now, what's interesting about this is the lawyer letter's a stupid letter. If you were to read it carefully, they argue or split hairs over her claim, for example, that they logged and cut down all the trees. And in this letter here, they're saying, well, yeah, you knocked down all the trees, but we reused them on the site. So her statement is true. They did knock down all the trees. They're splitting hairs by arguing that, well, we knocked down all the trees, we used them on the site, and that's a good thing. But at any rate, the point was to chill citizen commentary, to chill citizen reports about this stuff, such that their mothers read this. To go
Fred,
back to,
Fred, if you could wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes.
yes, appreciate that. So the outcome of the Vera's case was dismissed. As you can see here, they relied on the anti-SLAPP suit statute, no harm, no foul. Our insurance rates did not go up. I think the insurance company probably spent a fortune because this firm was a fairly toothy law firm. But the point of all of this is that citizens drive the needle on this stuff, that there's more enforcement that cannot be done if citizens don't step up and enforce, or help enforce rather, or help drive the enforcement of local laws. Hugely important, utterly vital if the system is to work as intended, and actually fairly noble, I think. The engagement required for you to get involved in local enforcement and to actually kick the tires on these projects that may or may not follow the spirit or intent of the law actually creates a scenario where we have observed a real reluctance by polluters to keep doing what they're doing because they recognize that there's a strong reinforced community surrounding these projects that are very attentive and very willing to engage. I wouldn't be daunted by the risk or fear of a SLAPP suit. That's the least of it, and they're rare. In 20 years, we've only had one of these, and again, it was an unsuccessful one. But I do point out that the ground rules are document what you see, be very clear about your facts, corroborate what you can, report to the local enforcers, don't break any laws in the process, and then be prepared to monitor and follow up. Absolutely key. It's rare that I drop something on the table of an enforcer and find 2 weeks later when I come back that they've actually done what they were supposed to do. That it takes those squeaky wheels to keep pushing through the system to find resolution because they're overwhelmed, because they follow processes that are sometimes cumbersome and slow. Not at all like the frustration that citizens on the ground feel from having to deal with these projects that are, off the hook and out of control in some cases. So I'll leave it there. I'd love to hear your questions and your inquiries about what we've talked about, but I think I'll yield the mic over to Pat.
All right, great. Thanks, Fred. And I will share my screen here too, my PowerPoint. Second here. Start this thing. Can you guys see my screen?
Absolutely.
All right.
Glad to see I'm not the only guy who's PowerPoint challenged.
Oh, there it goes. Sorry. All right, there we go. All right, so here so yeah, my name is Patrick DeArmy. I'm a staff attorney at the Chesapeake Legal Alliance. I predominantly work on citizen enforcement, mostly using state laws and federal laws to do citizen enforcement. So I'm gonna just talk briefly about citizen enforcement on like the county, state, and federal level. I don't have a ton of experience enforcing zoning regulations or ordinances or stuff like that. But I will touch on those things. So yeah, and then first I'll also just give a little plug for Chesapeake Legal Alliance. We are a nonprofit law firm that is in Annapolis, Maryland. We provide in-house legal representation to clients. Like, for instance, I am representing Fred in a certain matter right now for the Patuxent Riverkeeper. And we also provide, we have a pro bono network of attorneys and technical folks that work on a pro bono basis to assist other groups and organizations and individuals with environmental matters. And so if you are seeking, legal assistance in a matter, I put the link to our intake page on this part of the slideshow. And I have also, if you're interested in volunteering, whether you have technical experience or you're an attorney yourself and you want to get involved, I've also included that link here too. So, and on just before I get started on the rest of the presentation, I just want to just be clear that, I am an attorney. I'm not giving anyone like legal advice here today. I will be giving sort of best practices and legal information and recommendations about certain things, but this presentation isn't creating a attorney-client relationship between anyone or any organization on the call, and I'm not giving anyone legal advice, and everything I say on this call should not be considered to be legal advice or relied upon as legal advice. I just have to make that sort of just general statement before I get started. So with that, I will just then go to just generally, the concept of citizen enforcement. I'll touch on it from the federal law context. Basically, it means if you're an individual or an organization, then you have legal standing. You can essentially act as what they call citizens attorney general, and if you meet the requisite requirements, you can sue either the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, for failing to take a mandatory duty that they did not do. You can sue the EPA for that, or you can sue sort of individual polluters that are operating under various federal environmental laws for their failure to comply with the pollution permits. So those are the two main types of federal citizen suits that are that people can take, and there are a dozen or so federal environmental laws that have citizen suit provisions. A lot of them are ones that people are familiar with, like the Clean Air Act, which regulates sources of air pollution. The Clean Water Act, which regulates sources of water pollution. There's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also called RCRA, which regulates solid and hazardous waste and has a permitting system for that. There's the Endangered Species Act that regulates and protects endangered species. There's a Safe Water Drinking Act. There's the Toxic Controlled Substance Act. There's federal laws related to pesticides and herbicides and fungicides, and they all have various provisions related in the statutes that relate to citizen enforcement. What I predominantly focus my work on is citizen enforcement of specific federal pollution permitting laws, mostly the Clean Water Act, but also touching on the Clean Air Act and RCRA, the solid waste and hazardous waste enforcement laws and permitting systems. So basically, if you're able to enforce and take on a citizen suit, like I said, if you have legal standing, and generally the cases that I do are for these pollution permits where there's either an unpermitted discharge that's not, a polluting entity is not allowed to do that type of pollution, whether it's the handling of some solid or hazardous waste, whether it's a discharge of water pollution, or whether it's, some sort of source of air pollution that's not permitted. You can bring suits for those types of violations. You can bring suits for violations of permit limits, as well as for failures to report or monitor appropriately under a permit or other conditions of a permit. You can bring, citizen suits for those too. In terms of state law, there's not as much availability under state law to take on citizen enforcement actions. There was a recent change in state law for the water pollution control laws in Maryland. Basically, if the state files a complaint in state court against an entity for violating state water pollution laws, if you have legal standing, you can intervene into that case and participate in the case as a full party to that case and be involved in that way. But there's no way in state court to sort of to file a citizen suit the same way you would in federal court for violations of federal environmental laws. The way that the majority of the federal environmental laws work is that in most states and in Maryland, Maryland has what they call delegated authority under the Clean Water Act and under other federal environmental laws to essentially implement the federal permitting programs through the state permitting system. So in Maryland, if you're an entity that needs to get a pollution permit, you get a state permit, but that is a Clean Water Act federal permit. It's called a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. So it's abbreviated as NPDES, which is MPDES permit. So it's a state issued permit, but it's through the federal Clean Water Act, and the state of Maryland does that for many of the permitting systems. So they do that for the Clean Water Act, for the Safe Drinking Water Act, and other federal environmental laws that are related to that. So it's just sort of a little nuance where it's a federal law, but it's a state implementing the program. So if you're monitoring and following and identify pollution from a permitted source, you can essentially take a citizen suit action and file against them in federal court, with the goal of essentially stopping the pollution and enforcing against the violator. So like I said, I mostly focus on the Clean Water Act, and in talking to Greg in preparation for this presentation, I asked him what members of the organizations were dealing with on the ground in terms of like what types of pollution, and like that. And so, Greg let me know that a lot of what y'all are dealing with is construction stormwater runoff problems, which I will get into specifically. But that is, related to the Clean Water Act generally, as well as you can also look into and use various state and federal databases to identify all the sources of water pollution under the Clean Water Act within a certain watershed or a zip code, or the jurisdictions of by which your organizations operate under. So mostly this is going to focus on the Clean Water Act and then how it relates to state and local permitting issues. So just briefly, the main elements of if you want to, take on a citizen suit under the Clean Water Act. And also one other caveat here is that even though it's called a citizen suit, that's sort of like a legal term of art under the federal statutes. Citizen in this case doesn't mean an actual legal, United States citizen. In the case of the Clean Water Act and the majority of the federal environmental laws that allow citizen suits, citizen is actually a broader term, and it basically means any individual or organization that has legal standing. So to bring a case, so non-resident aliens or even illegal aliens and other non-citizens can actually take citizen suits on under the federal environmental law. So when I say citizen here, I'm not specifically limiting it to just American or United States citizens. It's actually broader than that. So I just wanted to clarify so people understand. So yeah, getting into the Clean Water Act, basically, if you identify violations of a pollution permit or unpermitted discharges that would be violative of the Clean Water Act, you basically, the first thing you have to do is file a 60-day notice letter. And the purpose of this letter is to put the violator, the polluter, the polluter on notice, as well as the state and federal agencies on notice that after the 60-day notice period has run, that you intend to file a federal complaint in federal court for the jurisdiction for where the pollution is occurring. So the whole point of the citizen suit provisions is to supplement the federal and state enforcement of environmental laws and not supplant the federal and state enforcement of environmental laws. So the notice provision is to give a chance for the polluter to come into compliance and to remedy their violations before the 60-day notice is up, or to allow time for the federal or state regulators to step in and do the enforcement themselves. If that happens, then generally a citizen suit cannot be maintained in federal court, and it will be dismissed if there is what I have down here at the fourth bullet, which is called diligent prosecution. Diligent prosecution is essentially a term of art under the Clean Water Act, which means if the state or federal enforcement agency is diligently prosecuting against the violator for the same claims that you would bring in your citizen suit, then your citizen suit is precluded from being maintained and continuing in federal court, which basically means you can't do it anymore. But jumping back to the second bullet, you have to have legal standing to bring a citizen suit. And standing basically is includes three elements. You have to be harmed by the action of the polluter. The harm you're suffering has to be caused or fairly traceable to the actions of the polluter. And then the remedy that you're seeking is basically you have to be asking for something that the court can redress. So if you're asking the court to, to side with you on a citizen suit, you're asking for, essentially a remedy that would redress the harms that you're seeking. So you have to have all three of these elements to basically maintain your citizen suit. And if you don't, the opposing side will basically move to dismiss your case, and if they are right, the court won't be able to hear your case. So so that's a very important aspect of when you go into deciding if you're going to be filing a citizen suit, is whether or not you yourself as an individual or a member of an organization have standing, or other members of the organization you're suing on behalf of have standing to bring the case. And in the case of environmental enforcement, standing is very broad. You can allege recreational harm. Say you canoe in a certain place, or you hike on the river and now you don't do it anymore because it's visibly polluted, or you have some aesthetic interest in the environment that's being polluted, and that has been harmed by the pollution, or you have an economic interest. It can be very broad. You basically just have to prove that some interest you have in the area that is being polluted is being harmed by the actions of the polluter, and if the court agrees with you, that harm will be stopped. So that's essentially what legal standing is. Then ongoing and continuous violations basically means at the time you file your complaint, you have to essentially be you have to be when you file your complaint, you have to show to the court that the violations that you're seeking to enforce have been ongoing and continuous at the time you file your complaint. If the defendant can show the court that they took all the steps to remedy their past violations and there's no chance that the violations will continue, then you can't maintain your suit and it will be dismissed. So it's important that you have documentation and monitoring, and you're following up on how often the pollution is happening. I already discussed diligent prosecution, but briefly, diligent prosecution is basically if the state or federal environmental regulator is already enforcing against the entity that you are seeking to enforce against, you likely won't be able to maintain your citizen suit, and it will be dismissed. Now, in cases of Maryland, if the state is enforcing, you can intervene if you have standing in the state court case. And so that's a way you can participate, even if you wouldn't be able to maintain your federal case. And then just lastly on this last bullet, generally, if you're seeking a citizen suit, what you're asking for is injunctive relief, which means you're asking them to stop the pollution and then to remedy the pollution. And then you're also seeking penalties under the Clean Water Act or whatever federal statute you're dealing with. And you could also seek what they call supplemental environmental projects, which would be a project that the defendant takes in the impacted environment that would redress and oftentimes better the environment and leave it in a better place than when it was, prior to their pollution. So that's just a brief synopsis of the Clean Water Act. And I'm going to just run through a lot of this is what Fred has already sort of talked about generally, is if you see pollution, what you should do. But this is sort of specific to construction, stormwater, runoff, because like Greg told me, this is a problem that y'all have been noticing in your communities and in your watershed. So like Fred said, if you see runoff, you want to document it. You don't want to trespass, and you don't want to, do anything illegal when you're gathering the documentation of it, because you don't want to be, or have any, liability from that standpoint. But you want to take pictures of where the runoff is coming from and where it's going. You want to file a complaint with this county and the state. And after the presentation, I have a list of resources that I will send to Greg and Mary that they can send out to everyone that is that's part of this presentation. So you can see a lot of the places where you can file complaints, and file them with the state and the county. So you file the complaint, and then you want to be able to track your complaint, like Fred said. So you want to get a tracking number or some way to be able to track what's going on with that complaint. And you always want to ask for an inspection, either from the county or from the state or from both. So that you can get a county or state inspector out there to identify more information, and they can also provide documentation about the violations that you identified. Then, generally you want to try to acquire the relevant permit documents for whatever site, you've identified pollution coming from, and that can be, the county level building permits and grading permits and those types of things, as well as the state level construction stormwater permits and things of that nature. You want to identify whether or not there's any opportunities for you to have public participation in a development project by identifying, what stage the project is in. If they're already in the construction phase and they're clearing land, it's likely that most of the public participation opportunities are over. But in most counties, citizens can be involved in sort of community input meetings and public hearings regarding the building permits and the grading permits and all that type of stuff. And it's very important to be involved as early on in the process as possible and make your voice heard and bring up your environmental concerns at that point. Because in my experience, once the county approvals start rolling, then the state approvals roll on after that, and it's very hard to stop a project or get something fixed once all the permits have been put into place. So it's very important to get involved early on in the process. Then next here I have nuisance/trespass action, which is say for instance there's a construction site that has a bunch of runoff that has gone onto private property. Maybe it didn't go into a stream, but it ran off onto someone's private property. That private property owner could have a basis to bring suit against the developer for trespass or nuisance caused by their runoff entering a private property. And so that's not a type of case that myself or CLA normally does, but it is something we have resources about, and we can point you to firms that do take on these types of cases. So if that's something that you're concerned or want more information about, please reach out to me. And then one of the other options here is, if the runoff from a construction site is entering a water of the state, you can pursue a Clean Water Act citizen suit, using the sort of playbook and formula that I laid out on the previous slide about submitting notice, making sure you have standing, documenting the violations, and going forward with it from there. So that's very quick because we have limited time here. That's a very quick rundown of the steps to take, and a lot of it was what Fred had already mentioned. And I will forward on a bunch of links and documents that I have that provide more information and details about this specific thing. And I also have I just have some resources here on this last page. So the first bullet point is 2 links for where you can report pollution to the Maryland Department of the Environment. There's the emergency reporting number, and then there's also a pollution complaint portal where you can report non-emergency issues. The second bullet here is called the Open MDE database, which is where you can acquire lots of information related to inspection reports, permit documents, complaint tracking numbers, etc., for where you can follow and track your complaints that you've made to the state regulator. The third bullet point is just a EPA guide and related to citizen suits and environmental justice that is useful for federal law environmental citizen suits. The next 2 bullet points are resources on Chesapeake Legal Alliance websites related to Clean Water Act enforcement, basically, and just fundamentals about the Clean Water Act. And then the last bullet point here is just a recent article in the Bay Journal about some particularly egregious and pervasive construction stormwater runoff occurring in Harford County. That's actually, turning parts of the Bay, or part of the Tidal Bush and Gunpowder Rivers orange because of the extent of the. I wonder if I open this. I don't know if it will share this link, the screen here too, but it's just an example of how bad the pollution can be from construction stormwater runoff sites. So that was really quick, and I went through a whole bunch of information there. I wanted to leave time for questions for Fred and I at the end. So that's I think all that I will get into detail about right now. Like I said, feel free to follow up with questions now or follow up with questions through me afterwards. And if you need specific legal help, we have the link there, for a request for legal assistance. So I'll turn it back to Greg or Mary, or whoever's going to lead the questions and answers.
Thank you, Patrick and Fred, for those great presentations. We have 10 minutes left in our normal meeting time, so I want to use as much of that as we need for answering any questions. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or unmute yourself.
I'm thrilled to see about 50% of the people on this call I actually know. Just check the names. How about that? It's a reunion.
So
Good
are we
afternoon,
supposed to
everyone.
like raise our hand or something?
Bob, yeah, you can go first.
So this all sounds very scary to me for reasons that some people would understand. Um, I have a question about this insurance. Fred, you had it on one of your slides, but didn't talk to it. Is that something that people should have, or is it expensive? I've never heard of activist insurance, but why not?
We do because our it's prudent, I think, in our case, because we engage frequently with polluters that have deep pockets. And our board has insisted on that. I will say there was an inequity for a couple of years. Our liability insurance covered the board, but not the riverkeeper, which I thought was a glitch that took us a while to fix. In retrospect, it's useful. Like I said, I don't find that slap suits are commonplace. Like I said, only 1 in 20 years is, that's not a trend by any stretch of the imagination. Our deeper concern, because we knew we weren't really liable, we knew we hadn't done anything. Our deeper concern was either A, our rates going up exponentially as a result of the case, or worse, being put in a situation where we had to actually report on the informants, which would basically chill the willingness of people in the watershed to talk to us about complaints. So we held the line pretty vigorously on that, and the court essentially upheld the privacy of those reports. Particularly because, again, as Patrick pointed out, the state was diligently prosecuting this case. That's why we did nothing. We investigated it, but we didn't actually do anything. So I was really stunned months later when those guys sued us. And again, the point was not to sue us to harm us, like many slap suits. The point was to get us to reveal the names of who had informed so we could sue them, which was even worse, really. I mean, it speaks to kind of the good faith or bad faith of the actual actors. So I wouldn't be terrified by that. We haven't been, not because we're reckless and not because we're devil may care, but because it's a rare phenomena, but it would be less than honest if we didn't at least report it as a possibility.
And Fred, I mean, it's just a general sort of liability insurance policy, right? That your organization has, or is it specific to?
We
Yeah,
actually had directors and officers coverage, and we actually had a separate liability rate waiver that covered the organization generally. When the two insurance companies, two separate insurance companies, worked it out, it turned out the general liability waiver was a better fit. So the directors and officers coverage never even came into play, frankly. Those guys handily paid out that, and I think that was a substantial payout. The firm represents Tesla, so these guys had some real juice. They hated driving to Calvert County. I'll tell you that much for nothing. They got increasingly worked up about the case the more times they had to show up for court appearances in Calvert. Driving down Route 4 was outside of their wheelhouse. So I don't know. I can't give you a smooth answer to that, Bob. I can't give you a perfect answer to that. I think you have to kind of weigh that with the organization. If you're working under the auspices of, I don't want to speak on their behalf, obviously, and obviously ACLT can speak to that. If you're working under the auspices of that group doing enforcement as it relates to easements, I have to assume that there's some kind of rider or something out there that protects you. I'll let Greg speak to that.
I don't know about that. As much as anything else, I'm just worried about frivolous suits that are brought against you just to even those to the common man can be expensive. I mean, even if it's, I don't know, $5,000 or something. I don't have a bunch of $5,000 bills floating around.
Yeah, usually they're designed to make you shut up. And
yeah, I understand.
The case goes away. All right. I mean, that's a tactic. So again, I don't have a smooth answer for it. It's a risk. I just don't think it's a big one.
Okay.
And if you get involved in that situation like that, you likely are going to be working with an attorney that's representing you specifically, and they can give you the rundown of exactly, what you should avoid to make sure there's no chance of, not no chance, but to limit your chance of a slap suit, like press releases, what you say in the public, like your attorney would in theory review all those things to make sure that you're not slandering or defaming anyone that's involved. As long as you follow the general guidelines, regarding that type of stuff, because that's the most common type of slap suit is defamation. So you just want to make sure that either giving your opinion or you're giving facts that can be backed up and or truthful. But yeah, like I said, an attorney that you'd have that would be assisting you would likely be able to review everything that you'd be putting out publicly to make sure that you limiting your chances of that.
And
Yes, that three
defaming is
tiers.
against a
Mhm.
person, right, as opposed to an organization or
I think
a
it can be
county
either.
or something.
I think it can actually be
It
either.
can,
But remember, you've got three rungs of defense there, right? First Amendment, the state's statutes against slap suits, which in this case, the judge was less familiar with it. It turned out we might have gotten this case dismissed earlier had the judge been familiar with it. It's relatively new, hasn't been out there long. It's mostly A, reporters, B, activists, and C, troublemakers that find themselves in that place. Good
Thank you.
trouble. That includes good troublemakers too, unfortunately. So glad to talk with you about it offline because again, I don't want to chill the importance and the urgency of citizens playing a role in this enforcement scenario. That's hugely important that people not get scared off because of that issue.
yeah.
All right, we have a question from Emma.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, what is the first step if you see, like, I don't know, a pipe with something coming out of it or construction without a silt screen or something? Is it to call MDE? We've had like
Yeah.
less success too with that during Hogan and stuff they were just like not around, they were working from home. So I don't know if you guys have found that that's changed. So kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, we always encourage people to report it to the state and to the county. Depending on the county, there's a lot of like back and forth about who has the enforcement authority over sediment and erosion control stuff. Like there are state laws about sediment and erosion control plans. There's a state permit, but then there's also all of the county level grading permits and all those types of things. So our best practice is to make the complaint to both entities and then follow up with both entities and see who actually takes it seriously. Yeah, it was a huge problem in Hogan. I mean, honestly, it hasn't, at least from my perspective, it has not gotten that much better. The development lobby in Maryland is incredibly powerful all over the state. And with that power just comes lack of enforcement from, in a lot of counties, I think, are actually captured by the development lobby. There's a lot of regulatory capture in some of the more pro development or development heavy counties. So it is really hard. I will say that like one of the number one issues that CLA gets intake assistance for, like requests for legal assistance for, is for construction stormwater runoff. It happens all over the state. It's a huge problem. So you really just have to stay involved, make your complaints to whomever, ask for inspections, follow up on the inspections, review the inspection reports, and then like reach out to us if you need more legal assistance on that. Reach out to your local representative from your county and to talk about how bad it is or what you've identified. And just sort of go from there. You really just have to stay on it and let them know that you're not going to give up, because they will sort of just push it off to the side, in my experience.
I want to go back to Bob's concern as well, because I just remembered. So you noticed I redacted the information about who the complainant was in that Baltimore Sun thing. She's a hell of an activist, very creative. And that letter from the lawyer really spooked her because she's a retired person who just doesn't want to end up entangled even in a pointless legal action, one that leads nowhere. So here's what she did. She didn't shut up. She took her case to the General Assembly. She's there now. She's trying to get laws passed to actually put quality standards into these restoration projects, and along the way has picked up one hell of a posse. She has a huge bank of citizens backing her up. So she took the focus away from that individual project and those polluters. So it's no longer an issue. What she's now trying to do is to solve the bigger problem of how to make sure that these restoration projects follow some kind of standard. So essentially, she took that threat of legal action to another level, right? That took her out of jeopardy, took her out of harm's way, but nonetheless, she's still fighting the right fight. And I'm really impressed by her. She describes herself as an ankle biter because she points out that women sometimes don't take it seriously in these types of matters. And so they marginalize her. But as an ankle biter, she feels she can tear the system up. I just want to share that anecdote. Like, ankle biters matter too. They can do a lot of damage to get things on the right track, if that helps. Just change gears. Don't give up. Don't shut up. Just change gears.
Hi, Mary. I have a comment, please.
Yeah. Hey, how you been,
Hi,
Ron?
this is Ron Clauda. I'm affiliated with the ACLT group and with the Friends of Hunting Creek here in
Yes.
Calvert County.
You well?
Very informative session. Thank you, Frederick and Patrick. Bob, I agree with you. It is kind of scary, but I think it's also a very challenging arena that us citizens, I think, are in. I'm going to make a rhetorical statement rather than ask a question. If our government agencies and our elected officials were doing the job that we pay them to do and elect them to do, would we really need citizen enforcement?
No. That's the whole, I mean, that's the whole reason it exists, is because when they wrote the Clean Water Act and when they in the 1970s and they wrote a lot of the other federal environmental laws, they actually showed phenomenal foresight in the fact that they realized that state and federal agencies weren't going to be able to do all the enforcement. And so that's why these exist. But in a perfect world, my job, I wouldn't have a job because that's all I do is citizen enforcement for when the state doesn't do or the feds don't do their job. And like that's basically 90% of what I do, is whether it's through citizen suits or public advocacy or whatever. So yes, if the feds and the states had all the resources and all the time and all the care and the want, we wouldn't need the citizen suit provisions. But they don't. Especially in Maryland, it doesn't happen. Maryland touts itself as being very progressive and environmental, but the enforcement is incredibly lacking in almost every, in my opinion, in almost every sort of sphere of the environmental regulation.
So having dealt with politicians in front of the camera and behind the camera for 40 some years, I think it's complicated. It depends. There are few situations where an elected official can be relied upon to do something that is contrary to their own political self-interest for all sorts of reasons. All sorts of reasons. And I've had elected officials drop their shields and tell me what is really true, which is they give a lot in order to get a little. In other words, they're in the business of compromise. And sometimes when you're talking about the environment, most times when you're talking about the environment, compromise is unacceptable. How do you compromise clean water? You just can't. Or clean air, or for that matter, unspoiled land. There's no room for compromise, and yet the system itself is designed for compromise. So I would hate to say that every time we see a problem with enforcement is because someone in a political role didn't do their job. Although the founder of the Riverkeeper movement makes that argument quite fluently, argues that most times you see a law being broken is because someone paid a politician. I just don't think it's that simple. I meet lots of people who are genuinely good elected officials trying to do the level best they can within an imperfect system. But you're right, sometimes, much have slipped between the cup and the lip, and they're at the root of that problem. But I do think sometimes we just don't have the legal tools to really fight all the fights we want to fight. Sometimes, right? The last thing I'll say on that is the first stormwater case I ever investigated back in 2004. What really made me mad was the state inspector said, when I asked him straight up if this place was in compliance, he said, as well as can be expected. And that wobbliness really bothered me. It's like, is that a yes or is that a no? Right. And that caused us to redouble our efforts to get attention paid to the problem because the state regulator couldn't give us a straight answer one way or another. What? As well as can be expected? What does that mean? So it's complicated. I would hate to give you a soundbite answer to that question.
What I've noticed in my short experience is that there seems to be a lot of wiggle room in interpretations, and believe me, the developers know where those cracks are, and quite often the inspectors may not be all that experienced. Quite often they're the lower rung of experience, and they're a little worried about their jobs, and maybe they don't. They're like, well, it sort of seems like it's okay, but it may not be okay in terms of the spirit of what was intended, such as don't dump a lot of, sediment into somebody else's creek, that sort of stuff.
It changes from administration to administration. My mother is long retired. She's 87 years old, but she was a state health inspector who covered a big chunk of Maryland, actually, during her tenure. And she told me it was very hard to get her bosses at MDE and other places to back her up when she was prepared to take a polluter to court. Right? The hoops she had to jump through as a rank and file employee were actually rather extraordinary to get that kind of backup from or approval from her bosses. So like I said, I don't know if there's a one size fits all. There's not one answer to that question. It just depends circumstantially.
It seems to me also that even if a citation is given by an agency, often the fines don't really seem to be sufficient to cause the situation to be fixed. I guess my question to you, that may know more than I, is that is it my cynical view, or is it kind of true that some of the developers just see being fined for violating regulations as the cost of doing business, and they can actually pay the fines a lot easier than they can fix the problem? I don't know if that's true or not, but does anybody have a thought on that?
Well, yeah, that's the point I was trying to make earlier when I worked for CBS, BBC, ABC, NBC, those guys. They had so much power and so much money and so many lawyers that the culture of those places, the ethos of those places was not to obey the law, to simply work around these obstacles. These laws were obstacles that stood between them and the thing they were trying to accomplish. So it is true. The business of real estate developing in this state is a powerful industry, politically influential, very pragmatic. These guys are thinking 10, 20, 30 years down the road, right? We're not always that pragmatic as activists. We're trying to save what's right in front of us. So yeah, we have very different worldviews, I think, those of us who want to protect these resources and those of us who think that's somebody else's job. These are battles worth fighting, and I don't believe they can be won without citizen backup. Citizen backup provides both the political environment that makes it possible to enforce these laws, but it also provides the informational basis, the local knowledge, the anecdotal knowledge that tunes up the ability to enforce. Don't underestimate the power of constructive anger, channeling your outrage about the environment into constructive channels. That's an art form.
All right, do we have any final questions before we end?
I'd love to talk with anybody about this stuff anytime. This is exactly where Patuxent Riverkeeper lives. So we're pretty accessible. If you want to talk more about enforcement, if you want to spread the word about enforcement and get better answers than we can give on the fly to the great questions raised by Bob and by others, by all means, reach out to either of us or all of us.
Same here. Yep. It's literally all I do. So if you want all the excruciating details about, I will provide a bunch of links to Mary after this to relevant resources where you can get permit information and all sorts of other stuff where to make complaints. And yeah, if anyone has questions, please feel free to follow up with me. Mary will have our email and she can pass those along too.
Yep, we'll send out a follow-up by the end of the week, so stay tuned for that. And thank you everyone